Welcome once again to Hope at Home as we get to spend some time around the Word of God together. All this year, I really felt that God wanted to talk to us about having order in our lives, or actually bringing His order to our lives. Because if we're living lives that are out of order, not only is there disorder and you get all these problems, but also you just never ever live the life that you're supposed to live, as we're constantly handling all of these things that would be much simpler if we just put them in order. So today we're going to be talking about in order to pray, because I really felt that as we're going on during this year, we're talking about order, talking about our lives, but then we start to think about what for. We're talking about our finances in order, doing good works. We're talking now this month about we're in this order. We need this order so that we can pray. But it's interesting the way that prayer and the order of our lives works together. For example, we need order in order to pray, and we also need to pray so that we can get order in our lives. Let me show you two places in Scripture. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7, he says, "The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers." Have you ever felt like if you really were praying in the right way, you would actually kind of get the answers that you need, that you get the solutions that you need? You'd have that relationship with God to think about the problems in life and the direction of your life. And you'd be getting that all out of this beautiful relationship with Him. But because of the chaos, or maybe just like the busy brains that we get, have you ever been like gone into prayer and it's like your mind is chasing rabbits down rabbit holes? You pray for a couple of minutes and then you get distracted and you go off. Well, we end up so distracted, and in a sense, it hurts our prayers. And because our prayers are hurt, we don't get the order, we don't get the relationship, we don't get the outcomes of the life that we're supposed to live. But it also works in the reverse way. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 to 2, one of the big chapters on prayer, he says, "First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead peaceful and quiet lives, godly and dignified in every way." You notice how the Apostle Paul he's noticing the entire Roman world, all of the places that he's gone and everything he's seen. He's going, oh, if you've got chaotic leadership, you've got chaotic lives. But we can bring help to the daily lives of people if we can get God's help to bring order in the governance, in the government of things. Do you ever notice like how people, leaders, politicians, they can create disorder, they can create panic, they can create anxiety. And you think about how bad it would be back in their day if you had a bad leader, how much harder you had to work, how much more problems you had to solve because these people in charge just couldn't get their act together. And Paul says, pray for them, because the more you pray, the more order they get in their lives and the more peaceful your life is. And so we learn these two things, that prayer is something that we go to get order. But prayer is also, we need to have an order in our lives even to pray effectively. And so I want to talk about prayer today. I want to ask this question: what kind of story would encourage you to always pray and not lose heart? We're going to look at the parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 18. He says, "And he told them a parable to the effect that they ought to pray and not lose heart." So in the next 7 chapters is a parable, a made-up story that illustrates this point. Now, I want you to just question yourself right now. What kind of story do you think that if you heard this, it would encourage you to pray and not give up? Think about that. What kind of story? Now, I've been doing some research, because preaching on the subject, looking at different things, and I asked this question of the internet. Why is it difficult to pray? What is stopping people from praying? Let me just show you a few answers that I found. Now, these are not like theological answers, or some of them are from Christians, but the answers kind of, in a sense, they cast a picture about what people think is the problem. So somebody wrote, "Some of the challenges we face when trying to pray are the things we come up with included distractions, fears, guilt, time management. These are the real obstacles. So these people are like, why don't people pray? I know it's a time management issue. It's a distraction issue. It's fear and guilt. That's what's stopping people from praying. And then I looked another place. And so somebody else said, well, we don't think we have time to pray. We don't think it's important to pray. And we don't believe that it makes any difference. So, maybe they interviewed people, they talked to different people, they come up with this idea. The reason people aren't praying, they don't think they have time, but you really do. Don't think it's important, but it really is. And we don't think it makes any difference, but it really does. So let me tell you a story. Well, there's another place I looked, and he came out with 5 solid points, all right? So you can't argue with 5 solid points. Number 1, prayer is not planned. So there you go, that's an order thing. Number 2, we doubt that anything really happens. Oh, that was in that second one. We don't feel close to God. Okay, I think that was kind of in the second one as well. We're not aware of our need. Well, all right, well, that's a new one. And we don't know how to pray. And so I was thinking, if I was Jesus or the pastor of the church of the world, and I was trying to encourage everybody to pray, should I deliver a story, an illustration that basically says, you just don't think it's important enough, it really, really matters, but you don't think that it does, and you got to make time for it, and you got to really believe that God will hear you. That's the message. And the problem is, I had a really difficulty slotting that into the story that Jesus told when he was trying to encourage people to pray. So to raise the idea that Jesus brings up, I want to talk about the difference between desire and burden. What is the difference between a desire for something and a burden for something? I mean, a lot of our prayer life is an expression of our desires. Like we want to have the right desires, which is why Jesus tells us to pray, Lord, your will be done. So when we're praying, we come to God. We're not supposed to be just like setting God's agenda for him. God, this is what I would like, and please can I have it on Tuesday at 3? Like I want this money and this time and this person and this opportunity, and I want to do all these things. Here are my desires. Go for it, God. That's not really what prayer is about. We kind of know that. But prayer is also an expression of our desires to have a different life, desires to have answers, desires to be better people, desires to walk with more forgiveness. We have all these kind of desires. They're churning away. But what's the difference between that and something you might call a burden? It's why people might want to pray and what drives them to pray. Desires, they create a want in us. And so we kind of go to God for the solutions. But when we are driven to prayer, that's really a different experience, isn't it? It's kind of like the difference between the disciples and Jesus. On the night that Jesus is betrayed and then handed over to be crucified, Jesus spends those final moments after Judas is gone. He spends those final moments of his so-called freedom with his disciples in the olive grove on Mount Olives. And he takes them out there, and he takes them and specifically asks them to support him in prayer. Like I've got a giant burden. I've got a huge issue. Can you guys come and please support me, surround me in prayer? But then they fall asleep. They fall asleep on Jesus on the very night that he is to be arrested. In Matthew chapter 26, verses 40 to 41, he says, he came to the disciples and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Now, Jesus very neatly and very wisely really pushes on the disciples the awareness that this is serious business. Prayer is not some token, thing that you can discard when you don't. Prayer is vital, and your lives, your spiritual welfare, the direction of your life is reliant on you being in prayer about the very things that you're failing in now. Like this lack of prayer for you is a sign, is a symptom, but it's also the thing that will solve the symptom. And Jesus is encouraging them, but at the same time recognizing them because they fall asleep again. But it's very, very different to the alertness that Jesus has. In Matthew 26, verses 36 to 38, Look at this difference in Jesus. It says, then Jesus went with them to the place called Gethsemane, where he says to the disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. Now, the things that couldn't keep the disciples awake because they didn't carry the burden are make it so that Jesus can't even sleep. Do you know that difference? You know, like if you can just kind of quietly lay your head down and go to sleep, it's because there's something that's not on you, that's not upsetting you, that's not wearying you, that's not drawing your anxiety and concern. Everybody's experienced this. We all know it's like when we are just that on edge that we just can't even rest. And that's what Jesus is like. He's like, I've got something that's so important to me that I've got to pray all night. You couldn't even get me to sleep. You would not be able to I'm not falling asleep tonight. There is way too much on my heart before God. Now, the difference between I desire to pray, like the disciples might have had, is very different than the burden that Christ had in prayer. And that understanding between desire and a burden is very important to understand the parable. Because when the person writes and he says, well, the reason that you don't pray is, let's say, it's not planned. You don't know if anything happens. We don't feel close to God, not aware of our need. We don't know how to pray. All those kind of, let's call them excuses. It's not really what's happening according to Jesus. Because all of those excuses would go away if you had something else. If you had what Jesus has when he thinks about prayer. If you had, well, what I'm going to call a burden. Now, Jesus tells this parable. So I'll read the whole thing. He says, he told them a parable to the effect that they ought to always to pray and not lose heart. So always praying, not losing heart. He said, in a certain city, there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected man. And there was a widow in that city who kept coming to him and saying, give me justice against my adversary. For a while he refused, but afterward he said to himself, though I neither fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming. That is the story that Jesus told and to encourage people to always pray and not lose heart. He tells a story about a widow. So imagine Jesus is purposely choosing a person in the culture who has no husband and no means of support. So she has no political advantage. She has nothing. Nobody needs to pay attention to her. Nobody's losing anything if they say no to her. And she goes to a judge, somebody who obviously we want to know is the person who has all of the powers, in a sense. He's the one that can determine how things are going to go in her case. But he doesn't care at all. He's not a care in the world. He's just like, who cares? So Jesus has kind of set this parable up. A person who's got no leverage whatsoever, and a person who's got all the leverage but not a care in the world. Now, what happens in the story? Well, in the story, the guy who doesn't care at all ultimately does what the person who cares a lot asks. So, the widow in this story, and this is what Jesus wants us to know, the widow is unstoppable. She will not relent. So that's where we get the always pray and not lose heart, because the widow just will not give up. Now the question is, why? Why does she persist? Why does she not give up? Why does she just kind of go, nobody cares about me. This guy, he doesn't care about my case. Why does she not stop? And we were given the information that it's not because of the potential care of the judge. She's not going to him with a sob story with pictures of her, whatever. This is my child. This is my puppy. She's not trying to evoke pity. She doesn't do something to twist his arm. She doesn't come up with political leverage. She just is persistent. Now, number two, the judge ultimately rules in her favor. And he does it entirely out of care for himself. Jesus wants you to know that. He does not help her because he cares at all about her. He recognized that her pain, whatever it was, and her pursuit of the relief of that pain was going to give him pain and give him no relief. Do you see that? What's happening? The judge recognized, I am not going to get a moment's rest until this woman shuts up. So I need to just do it. He cares about himself because he knows she is so persistent because of her pain. She won't stop. So the judge was immovable and uncaring. He did not care. Why was he moved? She moved him because it mattered to her. That's the story that Jesus tells us so that we will always pray and not give up. He doesn't talk about, well, you didn't make time for it. He doesn't talk about, well, you don't know about prayer. He doesn't talk about, oh, you don't know that God's listening. He doesn't talk about, no, you haven't made a prayer. He doesn't talk about any of those things. He says, the reason people pray is because it matters to them. Because it deeply, deeply matters. So then he summarizes it with this statement. He says, God is not like that judge. But as the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge said. And will not God give justice to his elect, who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? No, I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? You see, Jesus is saying that prayer is a picture of the faith that you have, the belief that you have about what God desires. And when faith enters to your heart, it transforms your perspective on life. And that's meant to give you a heart of things that matter, that really, really matter. And God is not like the unrighteous judge who doesn't care. In fact, God is the most justest, right, wrong oriented being that ever was. When you say, oh, this is hurting me, and you ask yourself, does God care? God cares far more than you care. But what God gives us in prayer is he gives the opportunity to come to him day and night so that we can present our petition to him so that the faith that we're believing for can be matched by his power and action because it matters. So in Psalm chapter 55, verse 22, there's this great psalm that's again repeated in the New Testament. And what he says is this. He says, cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. Now, I'll dig into that a little bit. That word burden is this Hebrew word, which is yehab. Sorry for Hebrew speakers out there. It comes from a root word, which is yahab, and it means a gift. That is something that's given to you by providence, by God. It's your lot in life, i.e. your burden. If I read that verse to you and said, come to the Lord with your lot in life, he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. It brings a little bit more understanding. If we just talk about burdens like, oh, I got to care about this and I care about that. He's not talking about that. This is far, far bigger. This is the burden of the life that you're called to live. The life that you're living now is filled with weight. It's filled with struggle. It's filled with difficulty. It's filled with, you can't quite get there. You don't have enough. And so there's two choices then. God can either change what's happening in your life, or he can sustain you in what's happening in your life. So prayer is about bringing your lot, your burden to God. And you can ask God, can you change my lot in life? I'm facing this issue. I have this sickness. I have this pain. I have this struggle. I have this lack. Or you could equally be bringing your burden, your lot in life to God and saying, God, can you sustain me in this? I've got this difficult marriage. I've got this burden to help the poor. I've got this person in my life who won't go away, but I need to be there for, and I want to help them. I've got this going. I've got that going. You see, just because it's your lot in life doesn't mean you want to change it. But then again, maybe there are things in your lot in life that you do want to change. I was thinking about how do people change their lot in life? And it made me think about pictures and stories I heard about when people tried to escape from East Berlin to West Berlin. You know, in history, when Berlin, the city in Germany, the capital of Germany, was divided up after the Second World War between the Eastern Soviet Empire and the Western powers, and the city was divided. Well, they put a dividing wall, but at the time it was wire fences and that kind of thing because they had to build the wall first. But there was a no man's land in between, and as people began to see that they were going to be trapped inside of East Germany and never to be able to live in the freedoms of West Germany, people begin to run across. And so for decades afterwards, people would be running between the walls, putting their life at risk. I've got this picture there that I found of a 77-year-old lady who is being let down out of a window that happens to be the street that is no man's land in between, so she can run across. So they've closed off the bottom floor doors, and the building is now a wall, and she's being let down because she just wants to live a different life. She doesn't want to live that life anymore. What would you do? It made me think about the immigrants that are coming up from South America into the United States because they think, if I can just get in there, my life will be so much better. Maybe I'll have to, do lowly jobs and all these things, but at least I'll be safe. At least I'll have a future. At least my children will have a future. And so people, hundreds of thousands of people from South America risk life and limb to try to get into America. Now, I'm not trying to make an issue about immigration here, but can you feel that? What do people do when they want to change their lot in life? Can you hear this with me? Don't they become desperate? Don't they have a burden? And that's the burden that Jesus is talking about. When Peter brings up this same passage and quotes it here in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, he gives us the New Testament perspective on that idea. He says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you." So translating it out of the Hebrew and into the Greek, he picks a different nuance. It's not just burdens, but it's all of the things that rise, the concerns in our hearts. And he says this, humble yourself before God so that at the proper time, just like he talks about sustaining and helping those, you can cast all your cares on him. Why? Because he cares for you. Now, those two words, cast your concerns, your cares on him, because God cares for you, are two different Greek words that are based on the same idea. The one for your cares is called merimna, from the Greek word merizo, through the idea of being distracted. So our concerns, as he writes them here, are the things that are driving you to distraction. You know when you go into prayer and you want to pray something and you're constantly distracted by something else? What are those distractions based on? In fact, it might be true that those distractions are the very things that you ought to be praying about, because those are the things that are causing the most anxiety in your heart. You're trying to pray this other thing. That might be important, but this is what's burdening you. And then it talks about God's care, which is melo. I love that. We're merimna. We're blah, 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 blah. And God is melo, because it means he's of interest in. That is, it's a concern because it matters to me. He wants to take care of us because we matter. You see, we end up with these burdens of distraction pulling us. And God ends up something that deeply matters to him. It's his burden to care for us. So I've translated this. So I'll just put this down as Joe's English version. What I think he's kind of saying here is, live humbly before the all-powerful God who can raise us above our lot in this life. Cast the things that drive you to distraction upon him, because you are a matter of concern to him. Can I just read that to you again. Maybe you just want to close your eyes and just absorb this. Live humbly before the all-powerful God who can raise us above our lot in life. Cast the things that drive you to distraction upon Him, because you are a matter of concern to Him. You know, it's really all about our attention. It's about the things that absorb our attention, pull our attention. The concerns that grip your attention right now. What are they? Now, this is about prayer, and this is about getting order in your life to pray, and this is about using that order to pray more. But what I'm concerned with right now is what I think this text is talking about, and what Jesus is saying is, what do you know in your life that weighs you down? What are the things that are causing distractions to you? What are the things that deeply matter to you? Now, those things might need to change, because things that matter to you might be really not significant, but you're never going to get that change unless you go to God in prayer. And the more you know God, the things that matter to you in life slowly begin to change. You know, before God's in your life, you might worry a lot about money. But then once God's in your life, you're not worried about your money, but you're worried about how you can use your money well. It's a different burden. Or it might be that you're anxious about all kinds of fears and distractions in your life, things that you see as potential threats. But when you come to Christ, you still might be aware of fears, but they're now not your fears, they're other people's fears. You see how the more you know God, the more your burdens change. I would love you to just deeply peer into yourself and ask yourself, what are the things that grip your attention? And then secondly, our attention then needs to be on God, who can handle these concerns. What Jesus is saying is the deeply held petitions that you have are what you go to God with weight and with burden. And those are the things that you are going to see results in. Now, those two things together, the weight and the action of the petition, is what prayer is about. And Jesus says, when you have a weight that you cannot lift or you cannot do something, it is a pain to you, you will pursue God in prayer until you find a solution. You just will. And that's the kind of thing that keeps you going, keeps you digging into God, keeps you asking, because it matters so much. Now, those things might be people who need salvation, people who need help, people who need healing. You know, when you get to the deepest things that matter, it ultimately, the things of the world, the things of temporary begin to drop off, and we start to care about how are people feeling? How are people living? How are people? And those burdens need to be turned into petitions. What would God have your burden be? And what would God have you do with your burden? Then we need to know then, thirdly, that God's attention is on us who are humble and in need. For example, it becomes an expression of faith to know that God is very, very concerned about me. He's very concerned about what is burdening me, especially as He has given me a lot in life, a burden in life, and He's the one that ultimately can fulfill that. He cares about me because He cares about what my life means, and He cares about me as a person in the middle. But do you believe that you are the solution to the problems that you're facing? That you've got the powers? You see, people don't pray when they think they can do it, because the burden doesn't stop. You just think, it's my burden and I'll do it. But what Jesus is teaching us is that when we bring our burden to God and we pursue Him in it because we just can't let it go, we're doing the thing that gets the answer. Because we're humble and recognize we don't have power, and God is powerful, and He's the one who can change our lot in life. So our attention, I was looking this up, attention is the cognitive process of selectively concentrating on one aspect of the environment while ignoring the other things. And that's exactly what the widow did. Her attention was fixated on two things: her problem and the judge who could do something about it. And that's it. She was not going to be distracted. She wasn't going to be threatened. She wasn't going to be ignored. She wasn't going to give up, because all of this, her need for justice, was undistractable, and her pursuit of the one in power because of the burden that she carried. It's the focusing power of burdens. Psalm 55:22, cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. The burden is there. Bring it to God. I thought we'd finish with just this quote of this fantastic hymn that I know we never sing in church anymore. It's not cool anymore. But some of these hymns teach us ideas that are really, really important. Here's the one called What a Friend We Have in Jesus. He says, what a friend we have in Jesus. All our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. So, my friends, what I'd love you to do is pray, but not pray in a, hey God, hey God, hey God, oh well. Pray from the burdens. Pray with a burden. Pray for the things that have meaning, that are touching your life, that touch other people's lives. Pray with a burden, and God will hear your petition, because he will never let the righteous be moved. He is always there. Take it to the Lord in prayer. God bless you. I hope you can put those habits into effect this week. God bless.